could you share with our audience how your interest in the Palestinian issue started and developed, and what led you to focus specifically on Gaza?
I come from a political home, you could say a left-wing home. It wasn't so much left-wing as it was pro-Soviet, and the two aren't exactly the same. In my case, my parents felt a huge debt to the Soviet Union because it was the Red Army that defeated the Nazis. And had it not been for the Red Army, they wouldn't have survived the war, and I obviously wouldn't be here today. So I came from a pro-Soviet, pro-Stalin home. I was active in politics from a fairly young age, which wasn't too unusual in the 1960s when politics was in the air wherever you went. And I was involved in the typical causes of that era, namely the Vietnam War, the Civil Rights Movement. And then in June 1982, Israel invaded Lebanon. I got involved in that. It's often forgotten. It's completely forgotten that until the events of the past 9 months, the worst bloodletting occurred during the Lebanon War. Went from June to September 1982, and the estimates are about 20,000 Palestinians and Lebanese, overwhelmingly civilians, were killed. And that threshold of 20,000, nothing subsequently even came close to it until the events after October 7th. And I'm not a quitter, so once I got involved, I pursued it, and as it happened, the conflict never found even a provisional resolution. So I stuck to it the past 42 years now. And Gaza became the focus only because on the ground, what was happening happened mostly in Gaza. The West Bank, since the Second Intifada, has been basically quiescent. So the focus shifted to Gaza. So I chronicled it from the beginning, especially since Operation Cast Lead.
Yes, and your parents were Holocaust survivors. Could you share with us how their experiences may have influenced your interest in Palestine and Gaza?
I don't think there's a direct connection between my parents' experiences and Palestine, Gaza. The connection is that my parents suffer terribly. That's not even an expression that remotely approaches what happened. On both sides, on my mother's side and my father's side, every member of the family was exterminated. So they were left. They were left alone in the world after the war, and those facts were constantly present in my home.
Okay, so going to your book, you've mentioned in other interviews that you wrote Gaza an inquest into its martyrdom for history, not for the people. Is that correct?
Yes, it didn't seem as if there was much future left in the Israel-Palestine conflict. At the time I was writing, it seemed as if at least in the short and medium term, Israel had won. And now it's, I think, probably forgotten, but before October 7th, all the talk was about the successor to the Abraham Accords that Saudi Arabia was going to be entering into in a pact with the United States and Israel, and that the Palestine question was basically over.
Yes, you have, if I'm correct, you have mentioned that in 2020 you have actually decided to stop writing about Gaza entirely.
Yes.
And then after October 7, I'm sorry. And then after October 7, you have made a comeback, so to speak.
By 2020, I was engaged in what you might call micro detail, going more and more and more deeply into this minutia, these micro facts. And it was interesting, fewer and fewer people, both because it was so narrow in its focus and because the Palestine cause seemed dead. So at that point, I felt the rational thing to do would be to just set this aside and try to make more productive use of what time was left to me.
Before we delve into deeper analysis of the book, could you summarize the key insights from the book, which is, as you wrote in your introduction, not really about Gaza, but about what has been done to Gaza?
I think the keen insight is the sheer magnitude of the horror that's been inflicted on the people of Gaza. It's very hard to comprehend the scope and the depth of the criminality that Israel has inflicted on the people of Gaza. I doubt there's any, well, the Vietnam War went on for several decades, so I suppose that might be comparable. But this sustained, merciless, heartless assault on a population that's comprised mostly, overwhelmingly, of refugees and their descendants, and in half comprised of children, and the kinds of almost, you might call it, Mephistophelian, satanic policies of Israel, this restriction of their diet, this denial of allowing toys, chocolate, potato chips to enter Gaza, in ways just which are totally, you'd have to say, there may be a rational core to it, but at some level, it has to be also seen as completely pathological. Just this totally sick mentality, which reached its peak after October 7th. Many people were shocked at the sheer monstrousness of what Israel was doing. But in fact, it's true the magnitude is much greater. But the actual policies, the starvation, the targeting of children, the targeting of medics, the targeting of hospitals, the targeting of journalists, the mass destruction, the indiscriminate destruction of homes, of dwellings, none of that is new. That's been a staple, a commonplace in Gaza since at least Operation Cast Lead. So I think that's one aspect. Another aspect is how little Gaza or its people or Hamas has played in terms of being a provocateur of what happened. Sometimes Israel would attack Gaza because it wanted to restore what it calls its deterrence capability, the Arab world's fear of it, restore its deterrence capability after suffering a major setback in Lebanon. So in order to compensate for its military setback in Lebanon, Israel decides to destroy Gaza. And sometimes the Palestinians were punished, or the Palestinians in Gaza were punished, because Hamas was seeking a diplomatic settlement of the conflict and was becoming too reasonable. So you'd have to go through operation by operation, but it is striking the extent to which how few were the cases where it was actually Hamas provocations that caused the ensuing conflict. And the third major takeaway is until October 7th, and October 7th really marked a major change, there was a complete betrayal by the international community of the people of Gaza. The betrayal took many forms. Sometimes it was outright lies. Sometimes it was just ignoring what was happening in Gaza. People sometimes mistakenly assume that most of my writing and public speaking has been devoted to documenting the crimes as they've been documented in human rights reports. But in fact, a large part of what I've written is to describe how human rights organizations and human rights reports have whitewashed Israel and have whitewashed Israel and betrayed the people of Gaza. After October 7th, it's not been commented upon, I don't believe, by anybody except myself. There's been a huge sea change. First of all, if you look at, for example, the South African application to the International Court of Justice, the original one, which ran to 84 single-space pages with literally hundreds and hundreds of references. And then there were subsequent submissions by the ICJ, which were also not on the level of the first one, but also quite formidable from a scholarly point of view. What's most striking to me, at any rate, is Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, B'Tselem, the Israeli Information Center for Human Rights in the occupied territories, the Palestinian human rights organizations. They barely figure in the documentation. In past cases, one looked to those organizations to get a reasonably accurate picture of what was happening, but they've been completely marginalized by the whole UN system. If you look at where is all the information coming from now? It's coming from, if you just excuse me for a moment, let me just get something I just printed out. If you look at where is the information coming from that we now rely on, I'll give you a typical list because I've been assembling it for something I'm writing. The UN Secretary General Guterres' statements. The statements he's making are simply unimaginable during the era of Ban Ki-moon. They were unthinkable. The Guterres has been pretty verbally aggressive. They come from the UN Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, what's called OCHA, O-C-H-A. They come from the UN Office for the High Commissioner of Human Rights. They come from the UN Development Program. They come from UNESCO, UNICEF, the World Health Organization. All of these UN agencies have found their backbone. They have, after decades, really, they have risen to the occasion So all the information we're getting now is coming from UN organizations, which in the past have been so timid to the point of cowardly in their accounts. I mean, you used to rely on them for what you might call technical information, numbers killed, mortality rates, things like that, number of people who entered or exited Gaza for technical points, but you never really relied on them to give a comprehensive expression of outrage at what was being done to the people of Gaza. Usually you relied on the human rights organizations. But now it's completely changed. The UN system, and it is a vast system of very competent, very professional, and very committed, individuals. You see it in the statements by the head of UNRWA, Philippe Lazzarini, the statements of the Undersecretary for Humanitarian Affairs, Martin Griffiths, and all the other organizations, Save the Children, CARE. If there's no, obviously there's no silver lining to a genocide, but I have to say on a very personal note, and it's going to sound so trivial, but on a personal note, I was actually relieved by all the documentation coming out now, because I don't have to do it anymore. It's all there. South Africa.
Yeah, it's completely understandable.
South Africa now, every few months, it goes to the ICJ again, requesting what are called more provisional measures, more demands made in Israel to cease its genocide. And each time it goes before the court, it submits another massive document with massive documentation attached to it. So that job has basically been done. There are areas where there are still a lot of gray areas, as is inevitable in a genocide. There are going to be a lot of gray areas, but the general picture, I think, has now is available. And I have been rendered superfluous by the fact that the human rights organization, the UN organizations have finally found their backbone.
And so you're noticing a significant change in their tone, but I have to ask you, what do you think is the reason behind the change?
I think there are, I would say I will list the following reasons. Reason number one is Israel crossed the threshold. The threshold is fairly easy to describe. Up until October 7th, Israel's goal periodically was what it called to mow the lawn. That is to say, to cut the Gazans down to size, to remind them who is in charge, to remind them who is boss, and to remind them that we're the masters and you're the slaves. That was the purpose of Israel's operations. After October 7th, Israel changed its goal. It was no longer out to mow the lawn. It was out to extirpate, which is just a fancy word, to pull out by the roots. It was out to extirpate every blade of grass in Gaza. Its goal was to make Gaza, to make Gaza uninhabitable, make Gaza unlivable, and therefore, if it's made uninhabitable or unlivable, then Gazans will, by hook or by crook, by some way, they're going to have to leave. And even yesterday, I spoke to a very knowledgeable person who lived in Gaza for a substantial period of time. And she gave me a figure, which I was quite surprised at. There are now 100,000 Palestinians in Egypt. Yes, I was not aware of that. And that's Israel's goal. Originally, in the first couple of weeks, they were hoping for a mass expulsion to Egypt. That it didn't work. Expulsion. But when that didn't turn out, they decided the goal would be to make Gaza unlivable, and then people will figure out a way to leave, or they'll just die. So once that Israel embarked on a genocide, it had crossed the threshold, and it was very hard to ignore it. It was so bestial in its manifestations that it was impossible to ignore. And so I think that was one aspect of it. A second aspect was that the UN organizations, nobody is willing to go out on the limb on him or her own, or on the organization to go out on their own. The UN organizations backed each other. It wasn't as if one was saying there's a genocide and the other one is saying everything is fine. It wasn't as if one was saying that there is mass starvation and another was saying there's no hunger. They backed each other. And so knowing that the other organizations are going to back you gave some courage to each organization. So I think that was a factor. And the third factor was that Israel is a completely lunatic country. That's not an excessive turn of phrase. It's a completely insane country. At least it's insane when it comes to Arabs. They possess a certain technical competence, and nobody's going to deny that. I don't think the technical competence is what it once was, but they retain a certain techno-scientific competence, but morally, spiritually, it's a completely lunatic country. And so it manifested this lunacy, at least in the first few weeks, before they realized that trouble may be brewing on the legal horizon. At least in the first few weeks, the statements they were making were so outrageous, and because of the social media, you couldn't conceal these statements, and also the videos that the Israeli soldiers were posting, that it became impossible to defend it. There are very few public defenders of Israel anymore, apart from the state itself. But when you have to resort to rolling out Alan Dershowitz or Rabbi Shmuley Bodiak, whatever his name is, you realize you're scraping the bottom of the barrel. There's not many people who will defend it anymore. So that was another factor. People won't defend it for a very simple reason. The evidence is too manifest that it's indefensible.
And when you've said a lunatic society, you're referring to those statistics about the support for the attack. Should it be even more brutal, etc., right?
Yeah.
Could you please, for our audience, recapitulate those statistics?
Well, there are two aspects. There's the statistical one, but then there's also the sociological one. The statistical one is roughly about 4 or 5% of Israeli society believes that Israel is using too much force in Gaza, that is insufficiently genocidal. Now, some people say that's because Israelis are ill-informed, that the media are just propaganda agencies. I don't think that's true at all. Okay, there's an element. There's no reason exaggerating. There's an element of that. But there are two factors which work against that explanation. Factor one, per capita, Israelis are the highest users of social media in the world. So if you're on the social media, you know what's going on in Gaza. It's not as if the state is, as in China or elsewhere, blocking access to sites which depict the horrors in Gaza. There's no dearth of resources. And the second fact is, Israel is a citizen army. That army, which is carrying out the genocide, is representative of Israeli society. You could say, like, even during the war in Vietnam, the soldiers who went over were not representative of the whole of American society. They were, you might call a minority in our society of losers, people who couldn't get regular jobs, joined the military, and so on and so forth. We had the draft, that's true. And the draft made it more representative. However, there are all sorts of ways to get deferments from the draft in our society. You got an automatic 4-year deferment if you were a student. You didn't have to go to serve. So you couldn't really say, at least for many of us, the soldiers were one category of people, and we were another category. We, meaning those who weren't serving, were another distinct, altogether separate category of people. So, for example, growing up, I knew of one person who served and was killed. Other than that, I didn't know anybody who fought in Vietnam. We didn't know. That's not Israel. Israel is a citizen army. Everybody serves, except for some special exceptions. Everybody serves. It's your father, it's your mother, it's your sister, it's your brother, it's your son, it's your daughter. So it's the same mentality, those who serve and those who don't. They're the same mentality. And when they come back, of course, some talk about what happened. There's no way you can just prevent any seepage from what you saw, what you did, from your new life having returned home. No, it's not so hermetically compartmentalized. Everybody in Israel knows what's going on. And they know it in its depth. They know it in its depth. Everybody, in my opinion, we could argue about it. Everyone in Israel over the age of 20 is either a war criminal or 6 degrees removed from being a war criminal. Because it's a citizen army, because half the population between the Jordan and the Mediterranean has to repress the other half. It is a very complex system to keep repressed half the population in that area. So you need people at the checkpoints. You need people in the prisons. You need people to conduct the raids, to conduct the bombings, the artillery shellings, the demolition of homes. Remember, at this point, Israel has demolished about 300,000 homes. It's probably more now. I'm quoting statistics from about 2 months ago. About 300,000 dwellings. And these dwellings, of course, a lot of them are demolished just in the air attacks. But in the northern and central part of Gaza, the destruction of the homes is very systematic. The army comes in, ropes off a neighborhood, blows up the home, or brings in the D9 bulldozers to bulldoze the home. It's a systematic process, methodical process. So virtually everybody is involved or is one step removed from being involved in this genocidal process. It was like during the extermination of the Jews, one of the crucial factors was the railway system. How do you transport all of these Jews to the extermination camps and to the concentration camps? It was a complex undertaking. The greatest historian and sociologist of the Nazi Holocaust, Raoul Hilberg, devoted a significant monograph to just going through the railroad operations to transport the Jews. And in the case of Israel, it's a half-century long occupation. More than a half century, actually, it's significantly more than a half century at this point. It's more than 60-year occupation. So everybody was involved in the process at some level, at some point. You take the case of Jeffrey Goldberg, who's the current editor-in-chief of the Atlantic magazine. So he once went over to Israel, decides to be as good Israeli, and volunteers to serve in the army. And then he ends up, during the first Intifada, 1987 to 92, the Palestinian civil uprising, he ends up being a prison guard in one of the camps, prison camps set aside for Palestinians. And before you know it, he becomes an accessory to torture. He's dragging the Palestinians to the torture chambers. I mention that because here is a guy from the United States, decides to serve in the Israeli army, to be a good Israeli, because it's a citizen army, every citizen, and before you know it, he becomes an accessory to torture. That's the reality of that country. And now with all the ugliness, like the pus bursting forth. The boil has been lanced, and it's this lava-like pus bursting forth. A very ugly place. Now, as I said, it's in the nature of things that two things can coexist, which seem logically to be irreconcilable. So, yes, scientific, technical competence. Yes, good universities, for sure. Yes, aside from the Arabs, a functioning democracy. That's all true. And also happens to be a lunatic state at the same time.
I just want to go back to 2009, specifically to the Goldstone report. Since you've talked about the shift in the attitude of the UN and in human rights organizations, and it seems to me that in your book you trace a negative shift to the retraction of the Goldstone report on April 1st, 2011, right?
Mm-hmm.
So
the Goldstone report was really a landmark because it was the only report, actually until October 7th, it was the only report that spoke honestly. And here I have to include Amnesty and HRW. It was the only, Human Rights Watch, it was the only report. It says the purpose of this attack, meaning caste-led, is to punish, humiliate, and terrorize the civilian population, which is absolutely true. It was not a war. These operations have never been wars. If you understand war as being a contest between two militaries and the attempt to prevail, so to speak, on the battlefield. That's a war, a contest between two armies, two militaries, and the goal is for one military to defeat the other. That's never been the Israeli goal. The Israeli goal is exactly what the Goldstone report said: to punish, humiliate, and terrorize the civilian population into defeat. That was its goal. To remind them who is the master and who is the slave, and not to raise your head too high, because if you do, we're going to cut it off at the neck. So the Goldstone report was unique in its moral framework, which exceeded the sheer legalities, whether Israel's attacks were proportionate, whether Israel's attacks were discriminate, or whether Israelis obey the principle of international law called the principle of distinction. Namely, it only targeted military sites and not civilian sites. It's completely crazy, because the whole point of the operation, as of the current one, the whole point of it is to be indiscriminate, to target civilians and civilian sites, and to be completely disproportionate. That's the whole goal. So even the most recent UN report by Navi Pillay, a very large report, 250 pages, single space. If you read the report, I think it was largely, not entirely, largely awful. But the most striking thing is they're using categories of analysis as if we're talking about a war. Israel was not being proportionate. Israel was not being discriminate. Israel was not honoring the principle of distinction. And I'm thinking to myself, what are you talking about? You're acting as if Israel was guilty of deviations, that Israel was not being 100% consistent with the law. The whole point of the operation is not to be consistent with the law. It's not a deviation from the norm. It is the norm. The norm is right now to make Gaza uninhabitable, unlivable. That's the norm. So when you confine yourself to legal categories, you miss the whole point of what's going on there. And Goldstone was the first one which, at least, it did, of course, use the categories of discrimination, distinction, and proportionality, because it's bound by the mandate. The mandate from the Human Rights Council was to see whether Israel was obeying the laws of war. But in its moral framework, it was much more expansive. And it spoke honestly about what happened in Gaza. And then the retribution was severe. Goldstone was compared to Dr. Mengele, worse than the Nazis. And eventually, I think he was blackmailed, but I can't prove that. He capitulated and retracted the report. It happened again, incidentally, quite recently with the ICJ, the International Court of Justice, on March 26th. It found that Israel was plausibly committing genocide. There's no question about that. All you have to do is look at paragraph 54. I think I have it in front of me. I'll just read it to you. 54 reads, in the court's view, the facts and circumstances described above are sufficient to conclude that at least some of the rights claimed by South Africa, it was claiming that Palestinians had the right to be protected from genocide. Some of the rights claimed by South Africa and for which it is seeking protection are plausible, namely the right to be protected from genocide. It's plausible. This is the case with respect to the right of the Palestinians in Gaza to be protected from acts of genocide. So there was no question about what it concluded. But then the president of the court, her name was Joan Donoghue, who happened to be from the United States. She went on the BBC program Hard Talk on April 26th, and she audaciously proclaimed, we never found that Israel was plausibly committing genocide. She did a Goldstone. She was such a liar, such a revolting, despicable liar. It got me so angry that I sat down and I wrote a 22-page single-spaced analysis of all the court proceedings. And I think I proved beyond any reasonable doubt, and I had experts who are intimately familiar with the detail. I can't name them because the case is ongoing, who confirmed that what I wrote was true, that she's just a despicable, low-life liar. I completed that exercise, and now I'm on another person, this soulless ghoul, this monster named Julie Sebutindi, who's currently the vice president of the International Court of Justice. She is from Uganda. And she has been writing the most disgusting dissents in the ICJ case. If she's listening, Ms. Sebutindi, or Judge Sebutindi, there are only two possibilities, in my view. You're either being bribed or blackmailed by Israel. There's no third possibility. And I'm right now in the process of writing an expose with the hope and expectation that she will be expelled from the court. She's such a wretched monster that I can, as you know, there have been reports for several months now about mass starvation, famine in Gaza. And so in the last round before the ICJ, before the International Court of Justice, in the last round, there were provisional measures, well, all along since January. The court has what's called indicated provisional measures. Provisional measures, it's very simple. All it means is we don't have time now to conduct the trial, but if Israel doesn't do certain things now, there won't be a trial because everybody will be dead. So a provisional measure is basically something the court orders now to protect the Palestinians because there's a plausible possibility that they're being exterminated. So one of the provisional measures by the court was for Israel to facilitate humanitarian assistance to the people of Gaza, which means stop blocking the trucks, stop killing the aid workers, and so on and so forth. So you would call that a very basic request of Israel. It's not asking so much, okay? So Judge Sebutindi, she writes that the courts are all wrong. The humanitarian situation in Gaza, it's improving. This is in January, when it was a complete disaster. She says the measure was unnecessary to tell Israel to let the trucks in. And then she says Israel has no duty to provide or to enable the provision of humanitarian assistance. In the middle of a genocide, in the middle of reports coming from every organization, from UNICEF to Save the Children to the International Food Program and so many others, saying there's mass hunger, famine, starvation in Gaza, she says, Israel has no duty to provide or to enable the provision of humanitarian assistance. So, as I said, Goldstone was a setback, and it sent a chill throughout the whole international community, in particular the human rights organizations and the UN institutions, because the expression became, after 2011, nobody wanted to be Goldstoned, because the assumption was the Mossad found dirt. I don't think they found dirt on Goldstone, in my opinion. I think they found dirt on members of his family. For example, his daughter was an Israeli citizen. She lived in Israel. So, nobody is skeleton free in his or her closet. And if the Mossad is conscientious enough, of course, they're going to find dirt. And Goldstone, in my opinion, was blackmailed into retracting the report. There's a lot of circumstantial evidence of that. And I believe in the case of Donahue, it was pure careerism. It wasn't blackmail. She was no longer president of the court. Her term had ended, which means she was returning to civilian life. And given her expertise, she used to be a lawyer for the State Department. So to return to civilian life and look for a new job, she had to repudiate what the court determined on January 26th, when she was the president of the court, and actually read out the court order. But in the case of Sebutindi, it's either blackmail or bribery.
And recently, there have been revelations in Guardian, if I'm not wrong,
Yes.
about Fatou Bensouda and.
Look, the story in the Guardian, in fact, it got everything wrong, because it made her out to be a hero because she resisted the blackmail. That's complete and total nonsense. I wrote a whole book. I'm holding it up now. I never hold up my books because I don't believe in profiting from death. But this is it's a scholarly question. The title of the book is called I Accuse. And you can see the I, the C are in different color because she was the chief prosecutor of the International Criminal Court. And the subtitle reads, herewith, a proof beyond reasonable doubt that ICC Chief Prosecutor Fatou Bensouda whitewashed Israel. There was a case before the court having to do with the Mavi Marmara. Now, most people have no recollection what that is. In May 2010, a humanitarian flotilla was en route to Gaza. It had 10,000 tons of humanitarian aid for the people in Gaza, and it came under attack by Israeli special forces, and they killed 10 people aboard the Mavi Marmara, which was the flagship of the flotilla. The case came before the ICC, the International Court, Criminal Court, the ICC, not the ICJ, the ICC, the International Criminal Court. And Fatou Bensouda did everything in her power to kill the case. She was so outrageous. She was so over the top that 3 times, she killed the case, and 3 times there was such outrage inside the court that her decision was appealed, and it went before what's called the pretrial chamber, and the appeals were upheld. They were upheld because she was such an outrageous flunky slave of Israel. And then the Guardian makes it out to be that Israel tried but was unsuccessful in blackmailing Ben Suda. They were very successful. What happened later, it's too complicated. I'm working on the book right now on it. It's tentatively called Rogues Gallery, to describing these things. It's an interesting fact, which I will talk about. You could call it the women of color, this new strategy of the ruling class. Fatou Bensouda was from the Zambia. Julie Sebutindi is from Uganda. Another was Pramila Patten, who wrote this completely idiotic report on rapes by Hamas, which she doesn't say by Hamas, I'm saying that. Rapes that occurred on October 7th. They're using now, like in our own country, Kamala Harris, playing the women of color card for a very simple reason. You know what the reason is? Because women of color suffer from intersectional oppression. That's the buzzword, the idiotic.
Identity politics, in essence.
Yeah. So you can't say anything against them. You see? Otherwise, you're guilty of 10,000 sins. So just to give you an example, when it came to the humanitarian assistance to the people of Gaza, there's an Israeli judge on the court, on the ICJ, because the way the ICJ works is it has representatives from 15 different countries on the court. If you are a party to a case before the court and your country is not represented among the 15, then you're allowed to appoint for the court a judge from your country. So Israel is a party to the genocide case. It's called South Africa versus Israel. Israel is not represented on the court. So Israel gets to appoint a judge. And it appoints Aharon Barak, former president of the Israeli Supreme Court. Now, when it came to the facilitating humanitarian aid to Gaza, even Barak voted for it. You understand? Because it's so outrageous to say, no, we're not giving you any food. You just can't say that. So Barak said, I know Israel's giving them food, but he says, out of deep humanitarian conviction, I have to vote for this provisional measure. Okay? She says, no. Israel can let them starve. That's what she says. She says Israel has no obligation to give them humanitarian assistance. So Israel has no obligation to prevent them from 2 million people, 2.1 million, 2.3 million people, half of whom are children. Israel has no obligation to prevent them from starving. I mean, it sounds, I said she's a soulless ghoul.
Very strong words, but
my point, let me see, I'm going to just, She writes.
Okay.
She writes, the fourth measure means the fourth provisional measure recommended by the court, has no link to anything having to do with the Genocide Convention. In other words, a state party has no duty to provide or to enable the provision of humanitarian assistance as such. All the court requested, all it requested was the state of Israel shall take immediate and effective measures to enable the provision of urgently needed basic service and humanitarian assistance. That's it. All it required was that Israel take immediate and effective measures to enable the provision of urgently needed basic service and humanitarian assistance. She voted no to that. She voted no because she says Israel has no obligation to do that. Even Barack said, I'm voting for this out of deep humanitarian conviction. My point being, how does she get away with saying something like that? It's totally sick. It's an ill person because she's a woman of color. She's a woman of color. And Fatou Bensouda did the same thing. How dare you criticize? She was so angry because the court kept coming back. The inside of the ICC. ICC is a far-flung institution with all these different departments, all of these different legal teams. And they kept saying, no, we're not letting Israel go on the Mavi Marmara. And she was so outraged. How dare you speak this way to a woman of color? They play that card. That's why I detest identity politics. It's all a ruling class ruse, in my opinion. I know that sounds conspiratorial, but since I devoted a 600-page book to documenting that fact, I have earned, by virtue of arduous labor, I've earned the right to say it. That's hard. That's the new thing. It's going to start with Kamala Harris, who's a complete airhead. And now they're all talking about her as being a serious candidate for president if Biden drops out. Yeah. You can count on the fingers of one hand the number of people that will vote for her.
Professor Finkelstein, I would really like to talk to you about that, but we have to go back to the Palestine.
It is. No, I'm not really going away from it. I'm trying to explain the mechanics.
Yeah, I see.
Of how these things happen, and also the fact that for the first time, there has been surprisingly consistent and persistent defiance by the international community. The Germans wanted to get rid of Philippe Lazzarini, the head of UNRWA. They couldn't get rid of him. Lazzarini has been pretty fantastic, as has Martin Griffiths, the Undersecretary for Humanitarian Affairs. And I didn't think Guterres would pass. I always freely admit to my errors. I didn't think Guterres would last past Christmas because he was going so far beyond anything that any Secretary General had ever said about Israel. There are, as always, because that's the nature of the world, there are contradictory phenomena. There is the backbone of the UN, but then there's the outrage of people like Sebutindi. And also Donahue, to deny what had been decided in January.
Yes. Tell me, Professor, considering our previous discussion on Israel's deterrence capacity and your quoting in other interviews of Hezbollah's leader Hassan Nasrallah comparing Israel to a spider web, fragile enough to disintegrate if you blow on it, what is your assessment of Israel's current deterrence capacity in light of October 7 and the recent interventions by Houthis in Yemen and Hezbollah?
I don't think there's a clear picture there. First of all, I think we have to have a realistic sense of what Israel's goals are, and then we'll see how successful it has been. I said shortly after October 7th, I said that Israel, this quote unquote operation, had three aspects to it. One was pure revenge. It was a revenge born of significant horrors occurred on October 7th. It's unimaginable for Israel. 1,200 people killed in a very short period of time, 2 days, 1 day. And 3/4 of them, well, 2/3 of them being civilians. Now, we should be clear about one fact before I continue. Israel would have been much more outraged if it were 1,200 soldiers. Israel is a Spartan society. It attaches more value to a soldier than to a civilian. So even though to a Western ear, the significant figure is 800 civilians, 850 civilians killed, for an Israeli ear, the significant figure is 400 soldiers killed. And some people say, why didn't Hamas just target military? Why did it target civilians? The fact of the matter is, the reaction would have been even more insane if they had killed 1,200 soldiers in that day. So the first, and the outrage, it wasn't just outrage at a massacre of significant dimensions that occurred. Can't deny it. We shouldn't deny it. Facts are facts, and facts are awful. You know, if you read Navi Pilay's UN report on what happened October 7th, it's horrible. There's no two ways about it. One shouldn't, in my opinion, deny facts. That's not part of the tradition I belong to. I think the leftist tradition, it may try to explain facts. It may try to extenuate, that means excuse facts, but it doesn't deny facts. So I consider myself part of that tradition, and I won't deny facts. Horrors of a very significant magnitude occurred on October 7th. That wasn't the only reason for the Israeli outrage. There was also the factor that it was Gazans, these Untermenschen, these subhumans who had outwitted and outsmarted the Ubermenschen, the Superman state of Israel. And that just caused, it multiplied the rage and the outrage of the state of Israel. The two main takeaways from October 7th, in my opinion, are, number one, Hamas proved to be much more competent as a fighting organization than had been previously assumed. And Israel, as a fighting organization, which includes intelligence and things like that, proved to be much more incompetent than previously assumed. Which brings us to the second aspect of the Israeli reaction to October 7th. The first, outrage at the facts, but also at the fact that they had been outwitted by these subhumans, these Jews in the eyes of Hitler. They had been outwitted by these subhumans. The second factor is Israel needed to restore its deterrence capacity. Because after October's capability, that simply means the Arab world's fear of it. Because after October 7th, people began to scratch their heads in the Arab and Muslim world and began to think, then maybe there is a military option against Israel. Maybe it isn't as invincible, impregnable as we thought it was. And to put it simply, Israel was determined to knock that notion out of every Arab's head. Now, of course, before October 7th, Syed Nasrallah, the head of the Hezbollah, he had been saying that Israel is like a spider's web. You just blow on it and it disintegrates. It was his famous speech after the Battle of Ben Shabil. But that was marginal. I mean, not that Syed Nasrallah is a marginal figure, but that was certainly not mainstream thinking. After October 7th, it became mainstream thinking. And so Israel's second goal, after exacting revenge, was to knock that idea out of every Arab and Muslim's head. The idea that the Arab Muslim world might have a military option against Israel. And the third goal was to solve the question of Gaza for once and for all. That, as one Israeli put it, I quote at the very end of my book on Gaza, he said, let's see if I could just find it here. One Israeli official, this was 2015, he said, another war with Gaza was inevitable. We cannot conduct a constant war of attrition. Therefore, the next conflict has to be the last conflict. And that turned out to be prophetic. That they said we can't keep going in and mowing the lawn. We have to, for once and for all, put an end to this Gaza question. And so it was resolved on October 7th that this is it. This is the last battle in Gaza. So those were that's how it conceived what it was doing after October 7th. Revenge, deterrence, solving the Gaza question. Revenge, deterrence, solution, solving the Gaza question. Now, in light of that, how successful has it been? I would say an inventory would say the following. I think it will succeed in solving the Gaza question because I was talking to somebody yesterday who lived in Gaza, worked in Gaza, and she said, you simply can't rebuild what's been destroyed. It's not feasible. After Operation Protective Edge, the estimates were there was 2.5 million tons of rubbish. 2.5 million tons of rubble left behind, wreckage or rubble. 2.5 million tons. The estimate as of 2 months ago was 37 million tons of rubble in Gaza. That would take 10 to 15 years to clear out, just clearing out the rubble. Remember, there's a lot of unexploded ordnance among the rubble. It'll take 10 to 15 years. So what will the people of Gaza do for 10 or 15 years before the rebuilding even begins? Just clearing away the rubble. So I think they did. They made Gaza unlivable. I think they achieved that goal. Deterrence capacity. I think it's a very unclear picture. Israel hasn't succeeded in destroying Hamas, that's true. But it's also true, Hamas didn't fight. It started in October 7th. So we have October, November, December, January, February, March, April, May, June. Okay? 9 months, there hasn't been one battle. I mean, have you heard of a battle where 100 people died on one side, 100 on the other? There's been some guerrilla activities by Hamas. My guess, I can't prove it, in actual battles, my guess is no more than 500 Hamas militants were killed. Now, of course, large numbers were killed, but that's because Israel is indiscriminately targeting the population. So, of course, Hamas people are going to be killed in the same way as Gazans are killed. It's indiscriminate bombing. You blow up a house, they're going to be Hamas people in the apartment building or whatever. They're going to die, you know. Hamas, I'm not faulting it, and it's not my business to fault it or to praise it. I'm just speaking objectively. Hamas has not proven to be, in the face of this genocidal military assault, this saturation bombing and artillery shelling, which exceeds what the number of bombs dropped by the US, the Allies, on Hamburg, and Dresden during World War II. There were more
London too, I think.
And yeah, during London, during the Blitz. And there were more bombs dropped in Gaza in 1 week than in Afghanistan in a year. It was just crazy. So how could you expect fighting? There was no way to fight. Everything was just being exploded and pulverized. So I'm not passing judgment, I never would, on Hamas. I'm just saying, as a military force, it's not been a significant factor. So what does it mean to defeat it militarily? I don't think it means all that much. Israel has reduced it to mean we want Sinwar's head. That's it. If we can hold up his head, then we can declare victory. I would say Hezbollah, it's a different issue. It's a different picture. Israel cannot let Hezbollah get away with what it did. They will not. Even though I heard today, I was listening to something, about 60,000 Israelis have been displaced. Somewhere between 60 and 100,000 have been displaced. The fact of the matter is, about that number have been displaced from southern Lebanon. It is basically even between the two sides. But I said a few months ago, and I'm not yet convinced it's wrong even today. I said, I believe we're closer. I think there's good reason to suppose we're closer to the beginning of the war than the end of the war. And I think there is reason to believe that now. Hezbollah has said, we'll stop the shelling if there's a ceasefire in Gaza. I don't believe that Israel will give Hezbollah a pass, even if they stop the shelling, because of that issue of deterrence capability. They have to inflict a massive blow on Hezbollah because it went one step too far. So that's why I was always skeptical about this talk of a permanent ceasefire, because Israel could start a war whenever it wants to. It knows how to provoke. Right now, it's doing exactly what it did in 2008. It wanted to attack Gaza. So there was a ceasefire in place in June. It prepared for the attack and was ready to attack. What did it do? It assassinated 6 or 7 Hamas militants, knowing Hamas would retaliate. And then it went in, Operation Cast Lead. And now Israel's doing the same thing with Hezbollah. It's targeting senior military figures, trying to evoke the reaction, which will then justify a massive assault in Lebanon. Otherwise, why is it assassinating these folks? In part, I have to be careful. We don't want to go beyond the facts. It is possible that they're targeting these senior Hezbollah military officers in order to demonstrate that their intelligence capabilities are the equal of Hezbollah's, because Hezbollah sent in the drones over Haifa last week, and it showed that it could penetrate Israeli airspace without any of Israel's defense capabilities being aware of it. And now Israel might be trying to send the message back. Yes, you can penetrate our airspace, and we can target every one of your senior military commanders. That's a possibility. It's a tit-for-tat demonstration of intelligence capabilities. The other possibility is they're simply trying to provoke the war. The one thing they won't do, by the way, the one thing they're smart enough not to do is to kill Nasrallah. They can. Your memory won't go back far enough. You're too young. But there was a period, even about 10 years ago, where Israel had penetrated the very top of Hezbollah, the very top. There was a person in Nasrallah's inner circle who turned out to be an Israeli agent. And so you have to imagine at this point, they know where he is. They know where Nasrallah is. So at this point, they have to know where Nasrallah is. If they can target, if they had infiltrate his inner circle, if they can target in a couple of weeks 2 senior commanders and kill them, they know where he is. But they're smart enough to realize if they kill Nasrallah, it's the end of Israel. The reaction from the Hezbollah, they revere him. They will die for him. Every one of them will die for him. He says they have 100,000 troops. I have no reason to doubt him. Obviously he plays psychological warfare, but in general, he's pretty accurate. The kind of reaction, imagine 100,000 suicide bombers armed with the best military technology known to humankind. And that's what Israel would be facing. 100,000 suicide bombers with cutting-edge military technology. One of the main achievements of Nasrallah as the head of the Hezbollah has been, if you're ever acquainted with people in the Arab Muslim world, everybody's a civil engineer, an electrical engineer, some kind of engineer, because that's the only place where there are jobs. The humanities that don't exist in the Arab Muslim world for the most part, they don't exist. So everybody's looking for a job in civil engineering, electrical engineering, IT. So they're highly competent in that. You see it in the United States, the students from that part of the world, none of them major in the humanities because their fathers, in particular, their fathers won't tolerate it. You're going to be an engineer or IT or finance. And what Nasrallah succeeded in doing was welding together that resource, that reservoir of engineering and technical capacity with ideology. So it's not just 100,000 soldiers. It's 100,000 with very high levels of technical military intelligence capacity who are willing to die for Nasrallah, who embodies the cause, So they're very careful not to target him. I'll tell you, it's a smart move. I've met the people from Hezbollah. Don't mess with them. A commander here, commander there, well, that's considered a martyr for the cause. And it's, that's what you signed up for when you signed up for Hezbollah. A martyr for the cause. But killing him, no. So I think it's still unclear whether Israel will succeed in restoring its deterrence capacity. But I think there are two errors, in my opinion, misjudgments that have been made. Number one, Israel has achieved one of its goals. It's made Gaza unlivable. And behind, you won't see it happening, but slowly it will empty out. As I said, I was completely shocked when I heard yesterday 100,000 managed already to get into Egypt. And you have to know, because you're from that part of the world, Gaza is only 2.3 million people. You have that many Syrians now in Turkey. That these population transfers of that magnitude are not uncommon in the modern world, in the current world.
Yes.
So the idea that Gaza will be emptied out, I think, is completely feasible. And I think it's inevitable. Israel won't let anything in. They'll claim what, they use the expression dual use. So they call cement a dual use items. Dual use simply means it can be used for civilian purposes or it can be used for military purposes. So Israel has barred entry of cement because it can be used to make tunnels. Okay? They're not going to let in cement. And 60% of the homes are gone. And you can't even begin to rebuild them if Israel did cement, which it's not going to do, because of all the rubble. They succeeded in their goal. They made Gaza unlivable. And as for the military aspect, I don't think there is much of a military aspect with Hamas. As I said, no praise, no denigration. I'm not putting anybody down. I don't think it was possible. Do you think the Japanese in Hiroshima happened to be a civilian city, but let's say it was a military city. Can you resist In Hiroshima, when an atomic bomb is dropped on you, idea of resistance is just stupid. And that's what it Gaza. Imagine resistance amidst a succession of atomic bombs. So I don't think there has been military resistance. There's been a couple of a guerrilla attack here or there. That's it. Maybe 500 militants have been killed as a result of battles. Large numbers were killed because they were part of the indiscriminate killing of all the people in Gaza.
And since we are at the end of the interview, do you have any final thoughts you'd like to share with our audience?
There's no silver lining in a genocide, so I'm not going to give an uplifting last word. I would say that I do believe, and I'm not just saying it because I'm obliged to say it, I do believe that it would have been much worse had it not been for the student demonstrations, the mass demonstrations, the ICJ, the South Africa intervention, the UN resistance. I think it would have been a lot worse. Now, is that any consolation? At one level, no. But at another level, and I know it's a cliche, and I always try to resist cliches, if you save one life, the one life might be your own. And I think more than one life was saved because of the resistance to the Israeli genocide. I think it put significant limits on what Israel could do, not the kind of limits we would want, but it put significant limits on what Israel could do. Just as what the Houthis and Hezbollah did has been significant. I think it would have been much worse if Israel was given a free hand. Now, some people want to say, oh, the ICJ, it's just talk. The student demonstrations didn't achieve anything. And they want to pour cold water on all the efforts that have been made. I'm not trying to give a pep talk. I'm trying to be objective. I don't think that's correct. I think they did put limits, but not the kind of limits we might have wanted or hoped for.
Okay, so it was a pleasure talking to you.